Organizations hired chief diversity officers, and DEI became such a big part of company corporate initiatives. However, when you look at where we are today, you're right. There are many organizations that have said we're going to deprioritize having a chief diversity officer or, make adjustments. I think part of this goes back to when things are uncertain, humans go back to what is familiar, not necessarily what works and what's best.
When it comes to building truly inclusive workplaces, it's not just about big ideas, it's about integrating them into every layer of the organisation. But how do leaders navigate resistance, measure impact, and keep DEI at the forefront? In today's episode, I'm joined by Gianna Driver, Chief People Officer at Lattice. From her unconventional start as a budding pediatric neurosurgeon to becoming a global HR leader, Gianna shares her insights on weaving DEI into the fabric of business operations, empowering ERG leaders, and tackling DEI challenges on a global scale. This conversation left me inspired by Gianna's innovative strategies and her candid take on the current DEI landscape. I know her journey and advice will resonate deeply with leaders striving to create meaningful change. Before we dive in, a quick favour. If you're finding value in these conversations, please hit that subscribe button and share this episode with your network. Your support helps us keep bringing powerful stories like Gianna's to you. Now, without further ado, let's jump into my conversation with Gianna Driver. Enjoy. Hi, Gianna. Welcome to the All Inclusive Podcast.
Thanks, Natasha. I'm so excited to be here live.
I know, in person. Woohoo! In the new setup in our studio, which is so exciting. I'm so glad to have you.
Thanks, and a gorgeous studio it is.
Oh, thank you so much. So let's get started a little bit. Tell our listeners a little bit more about you and your journey into HR leadership.
Yeah, I didn't start my journey wanting to be an HR professional. I actually wanted to be a pediatric neurosurgeon.
Oh, really? Wow, I've not heard that one.
Very different. Although one might argue that sometimes we sort of kind of do brain surgery, although not explicitly. And I started working in commercial insurance in the San Francisco Bay Area and quickly realized that wasn't my calling. And so then started doing work at a small company, and I was person number 3.
Oh.
And what's interesting about that experience is when you are employee number 3, you're actually not the HR person. You're a business operator. And I think that's a really important differentiator because even until this day, I think of myself first and foremost as a business person, secondly, as someone who happens to do HR.
Nice.
And so, over time at the startup, slowly started to, as we grew to like hundreds of people over the years, I naturally gravitated toward all of these things that I now know are housed underneath the HR umbrella. So things like hiring and mentorship and learning and growth, all of those types of activities that are under the employee life cycle and journey were naturally really appealing to me. And over time, I realized, the stuff that I love is called human resources.
Oh, wow.
And here I am 20 years later.
Oh, my goodness. That's such a great journey you have there.
It's been amazing.
I can't believe the neurosurgeon that completely threw me. I was like, what? That's one I've definitely not heard of. This is the reason why I love to ask that question first off, because it's just so interesting, people's journeys. And I think our experiences definitely shape the way in which we work and how we conduct ourselves and how we lead people.
Definitely.
So talking about leadership and people with diversity, equity, inclusion, what do you think the current landscape is at the moment? I mean, we've heard and we've seen a lot of organizations are scaling back on their DEI initiatives, and some are actually even dropping some of the kind of acronyms, those abbreviations like SHRM, they drop the E. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, let's roll back, I guess, a little bit, maybe, 5 to 10 years back. And I think this world of DEI, DEIB, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, existed 10 years ago, but it wasn't nearly what it became during the pandemic. During the height of the pandemic, when we were going through so much, there was in the US the George Floyd systemic racism. And I think all of those events really shed a light as to this urgent need that we have. And then fast forward a little bit, organizations hired chief diversity officers, and DEI became such a big part of company corporate initiatives. However, when you look at where we are today, you're right. There are many organizations that have said we're going to deprioritize having a chief diversity officer or, make adjustments. I think part of this goes back to when things are uncertain, humans go back to what is familiar, not necessarily what works and what's best. And I think this is where we who are part of this movement, us who are part of DEI and DEIB, have to make sure that we're committed to keeping these initiatives front and center. A lot of times in organizations, if they're going to make a reduction in force or trim some of their operational expenses, these fields, DEI, are some of the first to go. So therefore, I think it is mission critical important that we tie what we do into revenues and profits. I think that's part of the long-term sustainable nature of how we have to show value.
No, definitely. We say time and time again, integrating DEI into the business operation is so crucial. And I guess it's harder to scale back on something that's kind of part of every part of your organization, right?
Yes.
What advice would you give to others out there and leaders that are experiencing some resistance and are hearing from their C-suite that actually we need to scale back, we need to cut down?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the first things I've realized in my own experience is when you have a standalone function or person or team whose only initiative is on quote unquote diversity initiatives, it's a lot easier to cut something like that. I think a more strategic approach is to intentionally weave diversity, equity, inclusion into existing functions or to create new functions whose mission is not only DEI. And so that might look like a people analytics and a DEI function together, which is what we do at Lattice. That might look like having DEI be part of the HR business partner function. It could live in multiple different places, but I think part of the long-term sustainability of DEI is making sure it's not something that sits on the side. I think also if you think about it, what messaging does that send to employees? I think it's a much stronger message to say this is an ingrained part of our people function. And so it's part of whether it's the people partnering function or analytics or what have you.
Oh, yeah. And so I know you just touched on it actually with Lattice. You kind of combined that people analytics with DEI. Can you just share a little bit more about what does that look like just for our other leaders out there so they can kind of picture in case they're wanting to do something similar in their organization?
Yeah. Well, if we go back to some of the metrics, right, because part of what we need to do is show the value and the impact of DEI. The people analytics function is well poised to help show those specific metrics that we're looking for. And I'll give you some examples. If you take the overall attrition rate for an organization, let's say that it's 20%, 15%. Oftentimes, if you take the turnover or the attrition of people who are part of ERGs or part of DEI initiatives, not always, but typically, almost always, those turnover numbers are lower than the turnover for the entire organization. And so this is an example of a metric that I love to share with CFOs and CEOs because it shows when we have a workforce that is involved and active and they're doing things that might be outside of the bullet points in a job description, there actually is value to that.
No, I can totally see it. I know in my own personal experiences with work, it's yes, I could get to do my normal day job, that's great, but I always looked forward to doing those extra kind of curricular activities that are really going to boost culture within the organization.
Yes.
That I can kind of collaborate with others that aren't always directly involved in my actual team or department. It's cross-functional,
Yes.
right? Which is also, I feel like, for your own personal development, an opportunity for you to look outside of what others are doing.
Exactly.
And make a bigger network as well, and which will make you want to stay.
Yeah, no, exactly.
So, yeah.
And Natasha, you actually touched on something that I think is an important item to highlight. which is a lot of times those of us who are committed and passionate about diversity pay what I call a diversity tax, meaning oftentimes we have to do our DEI work on top of our normal day jobs. Part of the movement I would like to see more organizations make is saying, okay, if you're leading an ERG or an affinity group or, a circle group like that, that there actually is consideration for that. Maybe there's a slightly reduced workload. Maybe this is something in a performance review that is cited and there's credit given for that. Because I think if we say to leaders, okay, you're going to do all that you normally do, and on top of that, because you're passionate about diversity, then that's on top of everything else. That seems unfair because there is a value to organizations in having ERG leaders do the work that they do.
Yeah, definitely. And it's funny that you bring that up because I literally was just having a conversation with the Chief Diversity Officer over at HighSpot, and they've integrated about 7 communities now, so 7 ERGs within their organization. And one of the key things that she spoke about is making sure that those leaders of those ERGs are well compensated for the work that they're doing, because the work that they have done has actually led to the business creating new innovative products that will be able to service even more customers, which they would not have really delved into had they not had those ERGs set up. So I think it is really important because they do hold such a powerful they are quite powerful within the progression and just overall success of a business, I think.
Yes. I think that investment in ERG leaders could be extra compensation. It could also take the form of additional training and investment in their growth as leaders, which is something that is helping them as individuals, and also it helps the ERGs and the organization.
Yeah, totally. Well, I'm going to shift gears just slightly. Yeah. I want to talk about literally more about that global context because I know you do work globally.
Yes.
Lattice is placed all over the globe.
Yes.
And so when we're thinking about inclusive cultures and diversity and equity initiatives, how do you keep that balance? Because I think what's the term that I hear so many times is that global act globally, think locally.
Yes.
Yeah.
Think global, act local. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So how does that work?
Well, it's easier said than done, as many things in life. I think it starts by saying, okay, here is the global initiative. Here is what we are committed to. So it could be a diversity statement. It could take many different shapes and forms. And then I think having local people who take those global initiatives and then localize them, because we know with diversity, one program, one initiative may not be successful and translate well into all cultures. And I'll give you some examples of that. Let's say in the US, when we talk about DEIB, oftentimes that's talking about ethnic backgrounds and countries of ethnic origin for one's family. If you take that to India as an example, that diversity lens is different in India than it is in the US. And similarly, if you take that lens and apply that to an audience, let's say in Japan, same thing, where diversity, as we're talking about it, is very, very different. And at my last company, one of the programs that we did that was very successful was we in India looked at diversity through the lens of gender and also through the lens of, now this is dicey territory, but let's go there, through the lens of one's faith. Mm-hmm. Because in India, there are very segregated faith-based divisions in that society, but we know that when you're able to bring people together who have different lived experiences, you get better outcomes, better solutions to problems. And so we were very intentional about having groups that catered to the gender and then the faith-based backgrounds.
Oh, great. That sounds really interesting. So I'm just going to pry a little bit more into that.
Yeah, go for it.
Go for it. What does that look like in practice? Like, what were the kind of first couple of steps? Did you face any resistance initially and have to overcome that? What did it look like?
So there's an employee education piece that's really important. And I visited India multiple times, met with some of the most active leaders on the ground. And when I say leaders, let me clarify, it's not always positional leadership that we're talking about, because you can be an individual contributor, you can be, something other than the leader, quote unquote, like in an org chart, and still have leadership. And so met with a small team of people in India multiple times and talked about what do we think is going to be effective in getting people activated and help us to have more of an inclusive workspace. And they said, well, we'd like to create an ERG not focused on all of the things that the US population is focused on, which were things like, like race and ethnic background and stuff, because that's just not something that's relevant for India. Instead, they wanted to have a female focused group, because the challenges of being a woman in Indian society are quite different than the challenges that a man faces. And so this took having executive sponsorship, because ERGs that are simply grassroots without executive sponsorship often have trouble surviving long term. And then we came up with a program and a calendar and said, these are the events and initiatives that are purely educational. These ones are celebratory. And by the way, we want to have not just women at our events. We want to have men. We want to have people from all of the different groups come to these events. And so in an all hands, we started to socialize this and share about it. We came up with a logo. We shared the program and calendar. There was budget for this, not big dollars, but we're talking, like the amount of money that we also gave to the other ERGs. Mm-hmm. And in this grassroots way, it took shape and form. And it the first one was a painting class. They've done books where they'll read books by Indian authors. This is a really fun, active group that has done a lot to also create a place of belonging for folks who were struggling before.
Oh, wonderful. It's great. And so if you had to sum up through that experience, what would be the 3 key learning points for you?
So I think having a team of champions for the initiative, executive sponsorship, there also needs to be prioritization from a budget and time standpoint. And if you've got those 3 components, then from there you can create the programs and all of that type of stuff. But you must have those 3 to get started.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing that example, Gianna. That's really great. I think it's so important that we do add that kind of local context when we are thinking about DEI, because it can easily go left.
Yes.
And it's just unrelatable for a lot sometimes. And I think we do somewhat take a very US centric stance sometimes. Mm-hmm. I mean, here in the UK, we are quite closely linked to US. So yes, a lot of the things that come out of your way of the woods in the US that does somewhat also trickle down to us. But there are many places, like you've explained, like India, who don't actually, those terms, diversity, doesn't always mean the exact same thing.
Yep.
And it's great to hear that you've realized that and you've found a way to make it work and be successful.
Yep.
So what I want to talk about a little bit more is that sense of the data, which you said about the analytics and the people analytics. So what are some of what would you say, key metrics that organizations, DEI leaders should be really thinking about in order to be able to successfully measure the progress of their initiatives, the success of their ERGs?
Yeah. It starts by having a diverse workplace, right? So it's hard to measure anything unless you have individuals who represent the various different backgrounds and experiences. So that's kind of an underscoring of I'm assuming that in the question that we have a diverse, workplace.
Yeah. Let's go with that one.
Right. Well, because, I've recently come from the cybersecurity space, and I have to say, Natasha, that is not nearly as diverse as certain other industries, right? And so you can't take it for granted that in that space you're going to have a super rich, flourishing, diverse population. So it starts by having diversity within the workforce already. Secondly, what I would say is some of the metrics you were asking about. So things like looking at turnover rates, super important. Looking at rates of engagement. So engagement survey data, it's helpful to understand what is the overall organization's engagement, what is the engagement of our underrepresented minority population. Hopefully, it's either at or better than the overall sentiment in the organization. If it's not, so in other words, if people who are from URM groups, underrepresented minority groups, are less engaged and having a different experience than those who might be from the majority, then there's a problem. And if that problem isn't addressed, there will be a revolving door of diversity, which is not helpful for anybody. Other metrics would be looking at the promotion rates in an organization. So what are the promotion rates of our underrepresented minority groups versus those who are part of the overall or the majority? I like to also do kind of a cross section of, let's look at the individuals who are members of ERGs. What's the average increase that those individuals are getting year over year versus the average merit or compensation increase of other groups? These are the kinds of pieces of data that we want to hold ourselves accountable to make sure that we're treating everyone fairly. And then over time, I think what I've found at multiple different workplaces is those who are engaged in ERGs tend to have higher promotion rates, tend to get more increases over time. They tend to stay longer. They tend to be happier individuals, which I think is a strong case for ERGs and diversity.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much, Gianna, for all the fantastic insights and perspectives you brought in this conversation today. It's been phenomenal having you in the studio. Before you do leave us, I'm going to ask you a question which I ask all of my leaders on this episode, is one piece of parting advice that you can give to leaders out there listening in.
In what we do in the diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging space, we're very impassioned individuals, and that's beautiful. When we encounter folks who don't believe as we do and who might not value inclusivity, psychological safety, diversity, belonging in the same ways that we do, we become frustrated, many of us, myself included. I think it's very important to remember, for us to be successful in what we do, we represent all of us. And so approaching these topics from a place of love, from a place of inclusivity, is really, really important. I get frustrated too. However, this is about conversation. This is about building bridges of understanding between people. Valerie Kaur wrote a book recently called Sage Warrior. And in that book, she talks about how you are a part of me I do not yet know. And if we approach what we do in the ERG, DEIB space in this way, meaning when we encounter people who have very different opinions than our own, perhaps even opinions and actions that we disagree with, instead of getting angry and frustrated, approaching it from a place of love and understanding, I think is going to get us so much further than any other type of response.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's really great advice, Gianna. Thank you once again so much for joining me. Yeah. And for our listeners, how best can they connect with you and learn more about what you do and Lattice?
Yeah, so LinkedIn's probably the best place, just Gianna Driver. And if you do that and search for Lattice, I probably will come up.
Great, fantastic. Well, I will put a link down below in the show notes to your LinkedIn profile for everyone who is listening. They can click on that, connect with you, and do some more deep dives into the great perspectives that you have for DEIB. Once again, Gianna, thank you so much, and I can't wait to speak to you again.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me, Natasha, and what a gorgeous studio again.